Good evening, folks. It's good to see you all here this evening, and welcome to our event this evening, our plenary speaker. Doug Bandow is probably not a stranger to any of you who've been around for a while. Doug is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He's been there since 1984 with a brief stint in policy someplace else, but for a long time, he has been an integral part of informing policy, particularly for the libertarian movement, but also for the Republican Party in the office of President Reagan in the 80s, and had some really significant contributions at that point. But since '84, he's been involved with the Cato Institute, specializing in foreign policy and civil liberties, and he has been a regular commentator on all of the news networks that you would recognize: ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. I'm not quite sure how you make it to CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. That's a real skill. So that's something else. But he's also been a frequent contributor to magazines that you would recognize like Forbes, and also newspapers like the Wall Street Journal. We deeply appreciate having the opportunity to host Doug this evening. And Doug, I'd like you to come and give us your speech, and thank you very much for being with us.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's fun to get outside of Washington. Washington is a very incestuous place. It's a place right now that politics reigns supreme. The idea of values and morality, these are not issues that get a lot of attention in Washington. Politics is kind of the focus: who's up, who's down, who's going to win out of the budget battle, who's going to get the best press. But there really are some important issues that of a kind of moral vision, of morality, of principle that matter. And I think these are issues that apply to politics. They also apply to economics. And what I'd like to do is talk about kind of the morality of capitalism, the idea kind of business as a vocation, the thought of, how do we look at a free market system? How do we think of that within the context of morality, both Christian as well as other forms that one could imagine of morality? And I think that capitalism we typically think of in terms of policy questions, but every human institution deserves to be judged and to be assessed, and certainly capitalism deserves that as well. We know the founders in creating our country recognized that Americans, human beings, were sinful human beings. They had a biblical worldview, even if they weren't all Orthodox Christians. They tried to design a political system to take that into account. We certainly have seen over the years what happens when sinful human beings get power. We also see that within the economic system. If we look back to 2008 and kind of the crash, the problems of financial and economic problems, we know that not everything works out well. So I think it's worthwhile to step back and ask questions about the system that we have. And you can look at capitalism, you look at markets, whatever you want to call it, and there are two sets of issues, I think, that have been asked in recent years. One is the policy or the practical question that really was asked in the 20th century, and it was answered in the 20th century, which is what kind of economic organization is more effective, is more efficient, is more productive. And if you step back from the 20th century, there are many lessons that come out of the 20th century, but I think if you're thinking in economic terms, the lesson is that kind of capitalism was triumphant over socialism. That the one thing that stood out of 1989 and beyond was that collectivism in most of its forms was basically in ruins. That whether it was the really ugly totalitarianism of the Soviet Union, if it was kind of softer models, it was kind of a variety of kind of third world socialist states, that the reality was none of these worked very well economically. That by the end of the century, after decades of competition, that the understanding was that if you wanted stuff, if you wanted production, you really had to have free economic systems of various sorts. You could argue a lot about the details, but even by the end of the 20th century, kind of look throughout Europe, the left within Europe was basically capitalist. If one looked at whether it be Tony Blair or Gordon Brown in Great Britain, if you looked at a variety of French nominal socialists, if you looked at the German Social Democratic Party, Gerhard Schroeder, all of these people basically accepted a market model, and they simply argued about the details. How do you have better distribution? How do you work things? By the end of the century, everyone said, markets really work best. And obviously they aren't perfect. Again, you look back to 2008, we recognize that sometimes these things go very badly. We can argue about exactly why and the role of government and all of that, but obviously markets, like human beings, are not perfect. But basically, if you want to ask what kind of economic system works, I think markets prove themselves. But a very separate question, a very important question, is the morality of that process. Are they fair? Are they reasonable? Are they the kind of system that a good society should have? And all of those, I think, are quite fair questions. If you look around the world we live in, you think we live in a market society, it's fair to ask a lot of questions there. Many of those questions are asked by clerics, they're asked within, seminaries, they're asked by pastors, but the questions are also asked by others. You find questions asked within the environmental movement, you find them in other places. People who step back and will say, look, we may agree with you that the capitalism produces more stuff, but we're still not certain this is really a good way to organize things. Danny Cullum, who is with Sojourners, which is a kind of an evangelical left organization and magazine and community in Washington, D.C. Jim Wallace is the kind of the more famous member, but Danny was one person who wrote for Sojourners. At a conference years ago, he once commented, in his view, capitalism was the maximization of private profit over all other social goods. And I think that that really does set the question there, that whatever you think of the practical outcome of a system, that doesn't sound like a very good system. I mean, is that really what capitalism is? Is that really what markets are about? And I think it really is a moment to ask, every system should be subject to scrutiny. What do we think about this system? Our markets, is a market system really a system where all that matters is maximizing profit? Nothing else comes into it. And I think it's very important when you look at economic systems to realize some things call themselves capitalist that really aren't. Things that look very suspect, but it's not at all clear that they really should be considered a capitalist system. I think over the years, for example, a lot of third world countries had things where you'd see private property, you'd see people out there nominally in markets, but they were basically kleptocracies, crony capitalist systems. I remember the joke about the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines was that the Marcos family, they were kind of, anyone who remembers, highlighted by Imelda. They fled the Philippines and she left behind 500 pairs of shoes. They loaded up their airplanes full of stuff as they were stealing everything as they kind of stole away from the country. And the joke was that the Marcoses were engaged in mining. That is, they went around the economy and said, that's mine, and that's mine. These are systems that some people looked at that and would say that's capitalist, but I would say, no, that was really a system of organized looting. That was just kind of organized theft. The fact that they have some markets in there or private property in there doesn't tell you very much. A number of years ago, Hernando de Soto was at work in Peru, and he wrote a book called The Other Path, because he went out and he found within kind of the economic system, there was the elite who were all tied in with the politicians and all the famous people, and they ran everything. The politicians gave them concessions and took care of them. So then he'd go out and he'd talk to what he called the informal sector, the people who really worked. You'd go out to the people who drove the jitneys. Go out to the people who had the little stands that sold food. You go out to all the people who are kind of working and thriving. And they called themselves the informal sector. He asked them about capitalists, and they said, oh, no, those are the rich guys. Those are the guys who are well-connected. And he noted how, this informal economy was very entrepreneurial, but basically illegal. No property rights, no established rights, and no legal protections. It kind of shows that there are a lot of systems out there. When I think of capitalism, I think of simply a system of economic freedom. That is the freedom to trade with one another, the freedom to decide on selling one's labor, the freedom to decide on your occupation, the freedom to engage in commerce. And that basic freedom is really the issue. So if a system doesn't have that basic freedom, I wouldn't call it capitalist. I don't care what kind of institutions it has. I don't care if there are some folks there who have private property. And when you think of capitalism, we should think of a system of economic freedom, where people are free to trade, free to work with one another, free to set up institutions, free to operate. And despite, there are a lot of differences that are going to emerge in terms of culture, in terms of traditions, what kind of institutions. Almost anywhere you go, the ultimate kind of form of freedom is the flea market. I've spent the last 3 Julys in Shenyang, China, which is in Manchuria, where a university there has had a number of us in to actually give economic lectures, a seminar that the university has hosted. And I would go out every morning for a morning walk, and I'd always pass by one corner, and everybody's put out their blankets and they're selling things. That in many ways is the ultimate free market, where people just sit down and say, I want to sell this stuff. Somebody shows up and wants to buy it, and you dicker over it. There's no complex institutions here. It doesn't have to be a stock market. This is the very basic unit. But of course, this is a country, China, which now has stock markets. Over the last 30 years, it's gone from where flea market would be, what you'd imagine for capitalism there, to suddenly a lot of other things. That crossing cultures then is this notion of freedom to trade. So when I ask the question about the morality of capitalism, when I think about capitalism, my more basic question is this kind of economic liberty moral? Is it right? Is it decent? Whatever institutions you set up, whatever organizational framework, is this basic freedom to trade with one another moral? And I would say that the answer has to be presumptively yes. And there are two different reasons for that. The first is very much a philosophical one, which I would argue that the notion that you have control over kind of your own economic destiny, you are free to trade your labor, you're free to trade goods, you're free to make contact and work with others, cooperate with others, really affirms the very basic dignity and rights of the moral agent in human society, to make decisions that bear upon your own destiny. And it doesn't really matter, I think, what one's theological perspective is. If one views it from a more Christian context, that in a sense you're a trustee of yourself, created order of God, or in a more kind of secular sense of which, however one wants to view it, kind of the product of evolutionary processes, and you kind of stand there unique. Whatever one's vision of kind of the human person, the notion is that you are the basic moral agent. You will be judged for your actions. You should have control over those actions. And that should apply to the economic sphere as well as to other spheres. And it's not to suggest that the only agent that matters is individual. I hear about people kind of complaining about those who believe in this kind of individualism, atomistic individualism. And I have yet to find anyone who's ever grown up as an atomistic individual. Virtually everybody in America grows up in a commune. That is a family. It doesn't matter what that larger economic system is. The point is almost all of us grow up within a system that's highly collectivist in very many ways. Property's kind of held in common. The refrigerator is there. You can eat more or less what you want. All sorts of things in terms of how we relate. We don't relate in market terms. We relate in very different terms. The community, church, there are a lot of institutions that are extraordinarily important as individuals grow up. Nevertheless, if you stand before God in judgment, you stand before God in judgment as an individual answering for your actions. You don't stand as some sort of collectivity answering for your actions. So if that's the case, within that individual, those decisions should be ultimately vested. And even when people make very bad decisions, and of course any of us, I suspect, who has family or friends, see people who make bad decisions, and those bad decisions can be personal, they can be social, they can be economic, that even when people make bad decisions, there's something I think very important about the notion that you can make those decisions and then you should be responsible for them. That again, where should these decisions be placed but with the moral agent within society? We might decide that at the edges we have to restrict decisions in terms of what goes into a marketplace and what decisions we can make. But broadly speaking, the only one who can kind of make basic value decisions in terms of economic progress and destiny, to balance the benefits and costs of actions, to assess different choices, to accept responsibility, is going to be the individual involved. There are consequences for others, but ultimately those are going to be a responsibility that you're going to be judged by as opposed to something that can be taken over by anyone else. So I think there's that moral sense that these are inherent decisions that really need to be lodged with a moral agent and not in some collective order. And the second is a more practical argument that I think has some real moral overtones, which is very important in terms of how market systems operate. In the very basic sense of what market systems do very well is they produce. And that doesn't mean that we should look at kind of production and material things as the end-all of existence. There's the wonderful bumper sticker that one sometimes sees, he who has the most toys wins. And I don't think that's a very good philosophy of life. Toys are wonderful and we can enjoy them, but that's hardly the thing you want to order your existence by. Nevertheless, production does matter. That if you care for yourself, if you think in terms of your future, if you care about your family, if you care about those in need within your society, production does matter. And we certainly have seen, if you want production, the systems that offer production are those that are economically free, that reward those who produce, that are entrepreneurial. If you don't have that kind of economic liberty, it's very hard to have systems that work particularly well in terms of that. And despite problems that one can find along the way, if you want to choose what system is going to deliver more goods and more variety, it's going to be market systems. And I think there are two aspects to that matter a lot. One of which is kind of innovative, kind of transformational technologies. The Soviet Union could make steel. They could produce a lot of steel. They were pretty good at producing tanks. But you start thinking about information technology. You start thinking about a lot of the stuff that we now take for granted. These are not systems. These are not things that are made very easily, by kind of top-down management, by political decision-making. Similarly, in a very different mode, is basic consumer goods. I remember I was struck the first time I visited the Soviet Union, before it was no longer the Soviet Union, how we dealt with journalists. I was there at a Cato Institute conference, and the journalists I was dealing with never had enough paper, they never had enough pencils, they never had enough pens. This is pre-computer age. So we all left them those things when we left the country, because we could walk into any drugstore, or department store, grocery store in America and buy these things, and here they were journalists and they had trouble getting pens in their own country. I joked at the time that if you used the Soviet toilet paper, you had to believe that they were recycling their tanks into toilet paper. That the most basic kind of consumer good that we all take for granted was something these systems really could not produce. The only way they would produce them was for the elite. You went to the Communist Party Central Committee Hotel, they had better toilet paper. They're very, very hierarchical systems within which political power determined who got the economic goods. So here you have, systems where if you want to produce and provide people both high-tech and basic goods, that, well, what kind of a system do you want? And it looks very practical, but I'd argue that there's a moral overtone for this, which is if you're thinking about quality life, if you're thinking about how do you take care of your family, if you're thinking about achieving your potential, if you're thinking about having something to distribute within your community, whether it be to church, to family, to those in need, the way you benefit people, these kind of goods matter. And being able to produce them, where in fact, if you want aspirin, you can get aspirin. If you want pens, you can get pens. That there's something good about a society that produces those in abundance as opposed to one that makes it very hard to get those unless you happen to be on the Communist Party Central Committee. And there are a couple of aspects to this which I think capitalism does very well. One of which is distributing widely goods that actually really matter. When you start thinking, for example, about shelter, why do fewer people die in America in natural disasters than in other countries? If you have a better house, you're more likely to survive a hurricane. Very simple things where we might think of homes in terms of, well, if you're rich, you have a nice big home. But a very simple one is if they're better constructed, you're less likely to die. Travel, the ability to travel, and I enjoy it because I go around the world and kind of see the world, see parts of the country. I come to Boise, where normally I wouldn't go. I can get on an airplane the same day I'm there. But it's also, you can see family. All of a sudden, you move away. You can actually go back and see someone in a way that 100 years ago, you would have had to get on the train. 100 years before that, it would have meant on a horse. It would have meant, the wagon, train across, or the wagon, group across the continent. That these sorts of things matter a lot. Think of medical technologies, people who live today who otherwise would not live. Some of these things are extraordinarily important. And that, I think, matters a lot for our society. Second is widespread access. We think of a lot of these fancy goods and who's most likely to get them? Well, it's rich people. But of course, the rich tend to be the early adopters, and the rest of us get it pretty soon thereafter. The first computer that I bought was an Apple II Plus. Now, this is an early Steve Jobs creation. It didn't have a hard drive. You had to use these great big floppy disks to even get it to go on. And it cost me more. It probably cost me 3 or 4 times what I paid for my current laptop. That's far more powerful, does far more things, but this is something where the first ones are very expensive, but suddenly everyone has a computer. We went from an age where it was the IBM mainframe. A few people had computers, a university would have one, to suddenly everybody expects to have them, as well as iPads and everything else. This extraordinary distribution of some of these goods that once were thought to be luxury goods, all of a sudden are kind of driven out and pushed out into society because of market systems. And the third is who gets to decide what's produced. People often think of, it's Bill Gates or it's Steve Jobs, these big corporate titans. But what capitalism is really about is consumers. You produce stuff if people want them. You don't produce stuff if they don't want them. It's not like politicians get to kind of decide what automobiles we drive. They put regulations on and stuff, but they don't decide the designs. They don't decide the power. They don't decide a lot of this stuff. It's consumers. And it's extraordinary, some of the stories. Of course, companies have these great ideas of what they think people will want. The famous auto was the Edsel. It was named after one of the Ford family. And when you talk about Edsel, you think of a disaster. It was actually the name of an automobile. And it was one where Ford puts this out with huge kinds of press and publicity, and it was a complete dud because consumers didn't want it. that consumers really are king. I mean, people like a Steve Jobs are visionary. They try to understand what people might want, but iPhones exist because people want them. They line up in front of the Apple store when a new one's coming out and they desperately want them. It's not Bill Gates, it's not Steve Jobs that ultimately gets to decide what's going to be in our society. It's everyone. And that's something where I think markets are very effective of taking these decisions away from politics and instead essentially presenting them to the rest of us. And I would argue that there really is a vocation in a sense of being in business and providing these things, that this is a very positive good. So it's not the maximization of profit above everything else, but it's actually meeting human needs. It's cooperating. We talk about competition, but it's really competing to cooperate. Businesses work through competition, or through cooperation. I mean, the way you work, competition disciplines, but the way you succeed is cooperation. Companies cooperate with one another, consumers and producers cooperate. That what capitalism does is mixes, in a very interesting way, both competition and cooperation. I think those are very clear economic benefits. I would argue there's another important benefit that comes out of kind of the economic process of markets, and it's kind of a political spillover, which is it diffuses power. And that is extraordinarily important in any society. That, do systems concentrate power? Do they diffuse power? And this is one where, you think about, how systems operate. We have a lot of people who have a lot of economic power. We have a lot of people who have political power. But it's very hard to get all of this stuff in your hands together, because we have a very complex society. There are a lot of institutions out there. People form new businesses, or all sorts of industries, or think tanks, or this and that. Very different were systems that were kind of politically organized top-down. Collectivist systems allowed concentrations of power. The way you got economic goods within collectivist systems is to be in the political leadership. I remember a story in the Washington Post many years ago of a Soviet defector. And she had been a member of, her husband was a Soviet diplomat. They'd been stationed in America. That's where she decided to defect. And they asked her at one point, what do you think about Soviet clothes that you have to wear? And she said, oh, I never wore Soviet clothes. We all had Western clothes, of course. I mean, what do you expect? We're part of the elite. I went to North Korea 20 years ago. It's a very strange place, but they have hard currency stores. So I could walk in with my dollars and buy anything I wanted. I could buy electronic goods if I wanted it. I could buy Coca-Cola, which I was buying, and snacks and whatnot. And this is a place where North Koreans could shop there only if they were part of the elite and could get their hands on real money, foreign money that they could turn into the special money that was spent there. Even within that system, if you had political access and control, lo and behold, you have economic, benefits. The concentration there really, I think, emphasized the sense of what are the problem of humanity. That is a sense of original sin, that we're all sinners, as well as the more practical issue Lord Acton raised, for example, the famous aphorism, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That, collectivism concentrates the power and makes it far more dangerous, because you take people who are sinful, you create the temptation of power, and you hand to them concentrated power. Capitalism really does diffuse that. It's not perfect. Obviously, people try to get access to both. They get money, they try to buy political power. They get in politics, they try to use that for economic benefits. But it's much harder in a system that tends to have a lot of different power centers, tends to be competitive, and has alternatives. So I'd argue all of these are important strengths of a market system. That if you want a system that provides your people with a lot of things, if you want a system that tends to emphasize consumer sovereignty as opposed to political control, if you want a system that tries to kind of diffuses power and reduces some of the temptations of power, I would argue that markets are very effective in that way. Nevertheless, there's a moral critique that remains. That one can step back from all of that and say, yes, I believe in all that, I agree with all that, but still, what about? What about poverty? What about income inequality? What about monopoly? I mean, a lot of issues like that. And I think they should be taken on, that one has to confront them. That no system of human endeavor, like no person, is perfect. So no doubt there are problems out there. And the most obvious, in a sense, limitation, I suppose, on the marketplace, on capitalism, would be poverty. One of the great, I think, tragedies of our time is to think in a world of exploding possibilities, of transformational technologies, of the kind of opportunities that most of us have, is that we still have people who are poor. We still have people who aren't able to take advantage of those opportunities. I've always been struck, when I travel in New York, I very often would take the train up the Hudson Line. So you go from around 43rd Street, where Grand Central Station is, and you travel up through Harlem on past upstate, and essentially you think about the difference of say 100 blocks in New York City. Go from the financial district to Harlem, and you think about the opportunities for kind of the people within those different areas. You think it's very, very different. I mean, the financial opportunities of folks who are kind of making gobs of money down in the financial district versus those who are potentially living in real poverty in Harlem. You're within the same city. You're 100 blocks apart. Nevertheless, the lives are very, very different. And I think it really does tug at us. Anyone, I think, who believes seriously in Christian faith, feels a call that one has to be concerned about those in need. This is a persistent, call throughout Scripture, both Old and New. One has to be kind of ready to answer that. And I think it's important to recognize, though, is that poverty was the human condition until the rise of capitalism. I mean, if you look throughout medieval times, you certainly look at ancient times, essentially everybody was poor. The only folks who weren't poor were the guys who ran everything. I mean, if you were Attila, you had the horde who could steal stuff for you. I mean, if you're the king, everybody brings you tribute and builds the castle for you. The only people in those societies who were rich, who were wealthy, who were not kind of at the basic level were those who had political power and could use that to extract resources from everybody else. Whether you're a plantation owner and have slaves, whatever the system was, it's a very tiny number of people who weren't poor. The rise of a commercial society changed that. The rise of the commercial society suddenly provided wealth that diffused its way out. And it really did shake up and transform a very traditional order. One could argue some of those effects may not have been best. I mean, if you think about a very traditional agrarian society, if your belief is that's the best way to organize your society, but what it did is, it really did provide opportunities for people to escape poverty. It really is what created the notion that maybe we all shouldn't be poor. Even Karl Marx commented about, his view is that capitalism was the engine that raised people out of poverty. That until that engine was created and created wealth, no one would have any reason not to expect to be poor. That was the common expectation. It was the rise of the commercial society that transformed that expectation. Now, obviously, that transformation was very painful. You think of kind of the Industrial Revolution, you think of what it was like to kind of move from rural to urban, kind of what people went through. What's always important to remember, of course, you read Dickens, you think of Dickinsonian England, was that for the most part, people didn't go from farm to city because they wanted to be worse off. They went from farm to city because they were better off, even though we, looking back, can't imagine how that could be. But if any of you travel to kind of third world rural areas, today, you realize this is a very, very hard life. No electricity, no running water, no toilets. I mean, the toilets are simply wherever you find it. Animals running everywhere, kids die of diarrhea. This is extraordinarily hard lives that people live today. There's a reason then people, kind of fled to the cities. A very, very hard process. So capitalism kind of provided a process that all of a sudden we look around, and that's why today we say, well, why are some people still poor? We now have an expectation that has been turned on its head. Instead of expecting virtually everybody to be poor, we now expect everybody should be, if not wealthy, at least middle class, should have reasonable means, should have enough to take care of themselves. And then the question is, why are some people still poor? And without doubt, they are. And the real problem, and I think it's important when we look at capitalism, it's people are not poor because of capitalism. People are poor because they don't have the skills that within a capitalist system are rewarded. That is, capitalism makes no pretense that it solves every human end, every human problem. What capitalism, to the extent that it purports to do anything, is that it rewards people who are economically productive. That's it. It's very simple. If you produce things, you get rewarded. So it doesn't say it's going to reward the virtuous. It doesn't say it's going to help people who are in need. It simply says if you produce stuff, you get rewarded. So the challenge for us is for those who can't produce. When we think of the kind of the proverbial widows and orphans, I mean, very much, folks the Scripture was very concerned about in terms of how do you take care of them. Practice of gleaning in the Old Testament, a discussion in the New Testament about how do we take care of the widows and kind of within the faith community and reciprocal responsibilities. I mean, these are historic concerns of kind of a community of people who were not able in those times to kind of be productive and take care of themselves. And in many ways, that has persisted to today. We have folks who simply are not equipped, are not able for various reasons to produce and therefore be rewarded within a market system. So it's not that markets are making them poor, it's simply markets don't have a means not to make them poor, because markets don't reward where they are. What markets do, however, is provide the rest of us with the wealth that is necessary to take care of those who are in need. Then the question is, how do we do that? What kind of a system do you want to set up? What kind of institutions? And I think this is where it's so important to kind of think about a society, that a society should be free. That doesn't mean that the only institution it has is a market. In my view, as a free society has lots of different institutions. Among those are the kind of independent sector that reaches out to people who aren't very good within a capitalist system. That we set up other institutions. Part of that's through the church, part of that's through the kind of other forms of charities, secular charities and other things. We can argue about if you want a government safety net of some sort, government welfare programs. That what happens in a market system is that we suddenly have wealth that's available. If you're not producing anything, you have nothing to share. You have nothing to take care of those who are in need. That we need to look outside of the market for this. So it's not really a knock on capitalism to say that it can't solve every problem. What it says is we shouldn't just look to the market. We have to look beyond that. We have to recognize that we're talking about a larger society with a number of institutions that have a variety of roles. The market is very useful, but it's not the be-all and end-all. There are many other very important institutions that are out there. Separate issue is inequality. It's kind of related, but it's very different in certain ways. And the challenge, I think, is assume for the moment that you have an economic system that's reasonably fair in its processes. And that's obviously a very important assumption. If you have a system where the processes seem reasonably fair, any outcome is going to be unequal. Because any free society, we make choices, and suddenly those choices have economic impacts. So we could level income tomorrow, and the next day Celine Dion will show up in town, give a concert, and many of you will run and throw money at her, and she will be richer and you will be poorer. Or it could be the local sports team or whatever, local, I don't know, there'll be a new tennis match or whatnot, and the same thing will happen. That every day we make choices. The new iPhone is released, and half of you will run out and buy new iPhones, so suddenly Apple shareholders are richer and you're poorer. This is an inevitable part of any kind of a free society. So I think the challenge for us is to ask the question, is the economic system fair in its processes? That it's not the fact that there is inequality. I mean, what does inequality mean? If Bill Gates is wealthier than me, does that matter? I would argue probably not. That, I mean, if it's relative inequality, it really doesn't tell you very much. The question is, are the processes fair? And that matters a lot. I mean, a system that's kind of a kleptocracy, a system where kind of people use the system to their advantage, block other people's opportunities. Now there, the inequality is as a result of unfair process. So the focus should be on unfair process. And the second focus then should be in terms of how do you empower people? That is, those who don't have the best opportunities, how do you give them better opportunities, whether it be education, training? And that is an extraordinary challenge for America today. That if you look at an educational system that we have, that many urban students simply don't get good educations. You look in Washington, D.C., not only do kids graduate and they can't read their diplomas, but they get shot and killed in D.C. schools. And the response of D.C. administrators at different points was, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And you imagine that, you mandate the kids go to a local school where they don't get much of an education, but they're in physical danger. This is setting up, I think, a very unfair process. But it's not a process of markets. It's a problem that kids are not being empowered to take advantage of opportunities within a marketplace. And that matters especially in a society we're kind of looking at a globalized economy where the competition radiates outward. The competition economically is no longer just within a community, just within a state, but suddenly it radiates well beyond. We need to have the best preparation and training that we can have. So the focus, I would argue, on inequality is a question of looking at economic processes, political processes. Is there unfairness there? And empowering people to take advantage of the economic opportunities that are there. We should not focus in terms of leveling. The issue is not trying to make everybody literally equal. It's to ensure that people have equal opportunities to take advantage of the system around them. Almost any market finds itself with the challenge of monopoly. We have antitrust laws here. European Union has what they call competition policy. It's fairly common. And the question is, what about monopoly? The challenge, of course, with monopoly is it's very hard to hold a monopoly if you have an open competitive system. The best disciplining mechanism within an economy is open entry. That is the ability of anybody to come in and compete against you. If you're out there charging lots of money for something and not providing a very good product, people want an alternative. What we find in Washington is normally monopolies arise because companies go to Washington and say, protect me. I mean, that's where the monopolies get their strength, and indeed the most enduring monopolies are government monopolies. It's the post office, where indeed it is illegal to deliver first-class mail as a private citizen. That's the most enduring monopoly because the government can come down and literally arrest you if you compete. Well, that kind of takes care of the monopoly problem. What's extraordinary, I think, is if you look at a free economy, is how hard it is for monopolies to endure over time. 20 years ago, the Clinton administration was suing Microsoft. And lots of stories at the time. Microsoft was the great danger. Microsoft was going to dominate the internet. Microsoft was going to kind of run the online community. Nobody talks that way today. Microsoft is an also-ran. There's money there. Bill Gates is still rich. But no one that I know of spends their time worrying about what Microsoft is up to. Now it's Google maybe, or it's somebody else. What you see in these places is how rapid competition occurs. The latest story is on BlackBerry. I actually have a BlackBerry. I primarily use my phone for email. BlackBerry is just selling itself to a private, going private. It's cutting down the number of phones because it's basically been wiped out by the iPhone. 10 years ago, it was the big producer, the big seller for corporate America, for government, and now going down. Think of major retailers like Ward's. It's very hard, they disappear. Massive companies, worth a lot, as long as you keep an open competitive system. The challenge is always within the current system, everybody runs to Washington and wants to cut that down. So when we think about monopoly, the greatest danger is the desire for privilege within the economic system that then plays over into the political system. Kind of the joke, I think, is that the greatest enemies of capitalism often are the capitalists. When I was in the Reagan administration, I remember one of the first people who came into my office. I worked in the domestic policy shop. One of my issue areas was energy. Somebody came in to see me, and he worked with an oil company. And I remember he started out by saying, I'm for free enterprise, but. And then he went on to explain to me why he needed special privileges for his industry and his company. Yes, we all love competition, but in my case, of course, this is a really bad idea. And that is the common mantra in Washington. And that's where the monopoly problem really comes from, is the moment you can get a hold of the political process, shut out your competitors, put burdens on them, that's where you have to worry about monopolies. Another concern, and this is one that kind of, in a more cultural sense, is that markets can degrade other values, that sense of economic man, right? That people just become all consumed with consumerism, with markets, spirituality, family, community, all these other things go out the window. But I think it's very important to distinguish between problems of humanity and problems of economics. A lot of the things we complain about in terms of capitalism are really issues of humanity. Consumerism, that somehow capitalism turns us all into consumers. I remember visiting Goom Department Store in Red Square back in 1990. Now it's filled with boutiques and it's very expensive stuff. But then, it was basically the big Soviet department store and it was filled with garbage. Stuff that none of you would want to buy. But I remember the lines, of people wanting to buy products that no American would want to buy. They wanted stuff. Didn't matter that the stuff wasn't very good. They'd spend years on waiting lists to get garbage cars and washing machines that didn't work. And it didn't matter. They wanted it. That desire for stuff is a human desire. You think about the transformation of societies, traditional societies, agricultural societies by industrialization. Industrialization is not just capitalist. The Soviet Union industrialized at the cost of tens of millions of lives. China did the same thing. So there's a lot of kind of things that are tied to humanity more than economics. That, materialism is a desire that's out there. Marxism is materialistic. It's not that capitalism creates that. There are a lot of these things that I think are inner desires. And maybe capitalism inflames some of this, I suppose. That, advertising and the fact that it is so effective at fulfilling wants, maybe we want more than we otherwise would, I suppose. But I think it's important to recognize, these are common human problems. That, sin is a constant of humanity, that these are kind of aspects, those are outgrowths of sin. Hey, it doesn't matter what your economic system is. You're going to have to deal with these. And I can certainly believe that there probably are some things where, in fact, capitalism may get in the way, say a family. I think little things that, in fact, most of us would never want to do without. I used to joke, the first house that I lived at didn't have a garage. It had I just parked in front of the house. And I joked, then I moved to a house that had a garage. So you click the thing, the garage door goes up and everything. I go in. And I joked how, the second place, that garage door openers were an enemy of community. Because at my first house, I had to actually stop the car, open the door, and get out. And if my neighbor is standing next door in the yard, we talked. Well, if I'm at the house where I have a garage door opener, it doesn't matter if he or she's out in the yard, I click it, I go in, the door closes behind me, I go into the house, I don't talk to him. There are things out there that material things may actually, you can imagine, get in the way, but I'd hesitate to blame capitalism for that. It's a question of how we use them. That ultimately we should be very cognizant of what wealth does in terms of our behavior, in terms of, do we turn that into an idol? Does it affect, kind of how we behave? I think, that's why we were warned by Christ, how hard it is to get through for the rich man to get through the eye of the needle. That Paul warned us about the love of money is the root of all evil. That kind of a thing is very dangerous, but that love can be there whether it's a capitalist system or a socialist system. There's also, I think, a concern that markets and capitalism, in a sense, promote bad decisions. The fact that markets are there, they allow us to do a lot of bad things. And one can think about pornography, one can think about drugs. And I think this is where it's important to recognize, again, that capitalism doesn't purport to provide answers to every problem. Capitalism is very good at meeting what demands, our desires, whatever they are. So you can have a market in anything. And we, in fact, in the United States at one point had a market in human beings. I mean, markets arise, no problem. You have a demand for something, there it is. So that's not enough, and that's why we should not view markets as being the be-all and end-all of society. We have to ultimately make some judgments as a society in terms of certain things probably shouldn't be part of a marketplace. But those judgments will never come from within the market. They'll never come from capitalism. It's a system that has no morality within it. That's what really we have to think of markets, again, as being part of a much larger society. Part of that society has to be kind of the institutions that create values and morality and teach citizenship, teach virtue. And that's going to be church, it's going to be family, it's going to be community. That ultimately, that's where you step in and you decide certain things are beyond a marketplace. And we have to teach people, in a sense, what they should demand within a marketplace. We shouldn't ask for certain things. We shouldn't expect certain things. But again, the market will not do that for us. It doesn't purport to do that for us. It simply is there. It says, look, you want something? No problem. I can provide it. Those sorts of desires have to be set elsewhere. It's an absence. The market simply is not in a position to deal with that. That's a very important issue, but it's one well beyond a marketplace. Another concern, I think, from some folks is that, in a sense, markets are undemocratic. The great thing about democracy is we all show up and vote, we're all part of the process, and then markets are those things, some rich corporation is involved, or it's a Bill Gates or whoever. And I would argue that it's kind of the reverse, that markets are actually far more democratic than democracy. And by that I mean, in a democratic election, one candidate is elected. Doesn't matter what we all want, one candidate wins. I like to joke that back in 2008, I was issues advisor to Bob Barr, who was a Libertarian Party nominee. And I mean, this is one where, Obama won, and with that, what was it, 53% or something, and John McCain got 46%, and, my guy got, 0.5%. And there's some other folks out there, Greens, I think maybe Ralph Nader or whoever. And that you probably have to run a political system where only the guy with the most votes wins. But as a political commentator, I think it'd be far more interesting if you got to be president the percentage of days that you won, right, of the votes, right? So if, Barack Obama's president 53% of the time, John McCain 46% of the time, so you can imagine it's John McCain's president, we start a war with 4 countries, Barack Obama comes into office and stops the wars, Bob Barr gets his one day and he surrenders. It'd be kind of fun. As a political commentator, I would kind of enjoy that. It probably wouldn't work very well. But you compare that to the economic marketplace, there's competition every day. Every day, basically, Pepsi, Coke, Fresca, Dr. Pepper, all these kind of different brands are out there competing for your votes, which happens to be money. And Coca-Cola wins. Coca-Cola is the big one. But you can still buy Pepsi, and you can still buy Dr. Pepper. You can still buy all this other stuff. It doesn't matter. There's not just one decision, that in a sense, in that way, the marketplace is far more democratic. All of us get what we want. The problem with politics is it gives you one outcome. Well, there are a lot of things you don't want to have that system. So indeed, I would argue markets are much better in that system. If you don't have to have one outcome, don't choose the political process, that markets are very good at allowing you to have a number of different alternatives. And if you don't want soda, you can go get, I don't know, Snapple, or you can get iced tea, or you can get, I mean, think of the variety there. We don't have to vote and decide who gets what. Today, we're only going to have this. Tomorrow, we're only going to have that. In contrast, of course, collectivist economic systems essentially operate that way. Somebody in the Soviet Gosplan has to decide how many shoes are made, what style the shoes will be, what kind of beverages will be available. Somebody has to make that decision, and one person or one group of people will make that decision. That hardly is a system by which I think we would want to live most of our lives, that we want that, the variety of choice out there. Markets give that choice in a way that politics does not. And another area of great concern is pollution. That you can like the production out there, but think of the destruction of the environment. Think of the problems that come out of that, and especially, I think, as a Christian concerned about stewardship, the notion that we are stewards of God's creation. It's not ours to destroy, but instead we're supposed to be essentially preserving and conserving. And I think this is another one of those areas where the problem of pollution is basically the lack of markets. That is, for the most part, people don't show up and dump stuff in your front yard, right? I mean, it's fairly rare for somebody else to try to turn your yard into a trash heap because you can stop them, and you have an incentive to do so. Call the cops, arrest them. But you think of the air here, well, how do you protect that air? How do I make sure that what I'm breathing is good? I think of Southern California, where my family retired, car-crazy culture, trying to stand out in my front yard. Can I sue everybody who drives by? Think of all that pollution you're putting out. I mean, the problem is we have areas where markets just don't operate very well because you don't have private property. You don't have the kind of system that operates in a way that you can try to allocate and use that. So you have to look for alternatives. I mean, there are some interesting ways in which one can use markets. For example, out west here, there are a lot of places where you have in-stream property rights in terms of streams. There are places in the world where even environmental groups can essentially buy water quality within a stream. Think of endangered species. Far better to try to create value in endangered species. I mean, question of how do you protect elephants? I like to tell people, we look at elephants and we think what wonderful creatures they are. In fact, they are. But if you're an African farmer, you hate them. They are giant rats. They're incredibly destructive. In Botswana, I went through an area that elephant herds had gone through, and they not only stripped all the leaves off the trees, they stripped the bark. I mean, they wiped out an entire forest. Dozens of African farmers die every year trying to defend their crops from elephants. So the problem is, what's the incentive structure? That for them, elephants are a cost. We think it's a benefit. Well, if you want to protect elephants, then you want to find a way to infuse value to local folks why the elephant should be protected, as opposed to why they should tell the poachers where they are to please kill them and get rid of them. So one has to start thinking, ivory markets perhaps, to try to kind of recycle that money into elephant protection. One needs to think about ways, kind of how economic incentives can matter. A friend of mine once called the Endangered Species Act, where basically you lose the use of your property if you're endangered species. He called it shoot, shovel, and shut up. If you find endangered species on your land, you kill it, you bury it, and you never say anything. Now, that's a really bad incentive system to have if you want to protect endangered species. That what you've got to be prepared to do is say, no, that's a cost all of us bear, not just you, the landowner. You have to think in terms of incentives, of how do you use economic incentives then, so we reimburse you, whatever the system is, how do we come up with a system that encourages rather than discourages environmental protection? Ultimately, the worst environmental protection that we've ever seen has been in the old Soviet system. There was a book that was published back during the Soviet days that was entitled Ecocide, looking at the interior Soviet industrial cities. You go to Silesia in Poland, you'd go to East Germany, Romania. What you found was horrid degradation because you didn't have political democracy, you had no environmentalist movements, you had no private property rights, you had no legal process, you had nothing, none of the kind of institutions that we have to try to protect. And the good news is that as you grow wealthier, the easier it is to protect. The more money you have, the better technology you have. I mean, automobiles today put off far fewer pollutants than those made 40 years ago. In many, many ways, we're far better off. Wealth and technology help provide that. So, basically markets are helpful in that fashion. Now, I think that at the end of all this is markets are not perfect. And indeed, markets, in a sense, don't carry a morality with them. But I would argue at a very basic level, economic liberty, economic freedom is a moral good in terms of what it means in terms of the affirmation of the dignity and the meaning of a human being, and that there's an enormous amount of kind of practical advantages that are really very useful and have moral overtones. That markets are not perfect. We as human beings have to be willing to stand outside of markets and create a legal, a moral, a political infrastructure within which markets operate, and we should view markets as merely one part of a larger free society. A free society that will have many things within it that are far more collectivist. I hope that, in fact, families remain very collectivist. I assume that people go to seminary not because they hope to make money, but because they have other ideals in mind. I mean, I hope that there are a lot of friendships, marriage, lots of things within our society that are going to operate outside of market principles. Nevertheless, a relatively free economic system, I would argue, is a better kind of host for a more virtuous society than a more political collectivist economic system. So I'd step away and say 2 cheers for capitalism. Like any human institution, it has imperfections. Any human institution run by human beings, it's going to have problems. But those problems and imperfections are far worse when we concentrate political power with economic power and where we start making those economic decisions collectively from top down. And I'll stop there. I'm happy to take any questions. China is an extraordinarily fascinating and frustrating and interesting and challenging place. I mean, it's an ancient civilization, it's a very complex society, very nationalistic but very entrepreneurial people coming out of a very awful period. I mean, what I find, this year I've been there already twice. I'm going back in December for a conference. I find students there, in terms of the future, very much interested in freedom. They want to travel, they'd like to go to America, they want to know the world. They clearly value individuality, value kind of opportunity and freedom. On the other hand, they tend to be very nationalistic. Taiwan is part of China. Okay, yep, all the South China Sea, all of that is owned by China. Okay, I got it. Its economy in certain ways is a mixed economy. There's a lot of chunks that are outside of government control, but the government still runs a lot, and they manipulate the banking system. I mean, they have a lot of potential economic problems because of that. I mean, you think about bad banks, they have these kind of empty cities, they literally ghost towns, they build these things, they figure they're going to fill up, and 5 years later they're still empty. I mean, there's an overhang of that stuff. In May, I visited close to Beijing. They rebuilt what had been foreign concessions going back 150 years. So there's this little Italy, Italian restaurants and stuff, which the Chinese built for tourists. It's the weirdest thing. And I don't know, does it pay for itself? So there's a lot of challenges that society faces. I mean, the political challenges are immense. The kind of Central Communist Party doesn't really have a lot of legitimacy. I mean, there's a lot of corruption there. The economic growth is kind of the legitimacy. If economic growth slows, I think there's a real challenge politically. I mean, the Central Party admits that there are tens of thousands of demonstrations, I mean, across the country, provincial level. I mean, a lot of these provincial chiefs are real thieves. There was one a couple of years ago. Basically, the local folks drove out the entire political elite because they were stealing property and giving it to developers. One of the interesting, something went viral. Gary Locke, who had been governor of Washington State, was Commerce Secretary, is the U.S. ambassador. And he's the first ethnic Chinese to be the U.S. ambassador to China. And he flew over, and he was flying, a Chinese person, a traveler, took a photo of him. He was like standing at a Starbucks holding his child's hand with a backpack. Now, we would look at that and kind of, well, who cares, right? It went viral in China because no important official would ever travel where you would have to carry your own luggage and order your own food. I mean, this is a place, I mean, you have retinues of people. And they've recently cracked down. I was there in July, and one of the new president, Xi Jinping, has kind of, to try to dampen some of the sentiments, you're no longer supposed to have these massive banquets. I mean, you're literally going the round, this kind of lazy Susan that goes around and around, there's more and more stuff, and drinks and everything. So they've kind of cut down a lot on that because of the ostentatious nature of it. But I mean, so in certain ways, there's a powder keg there. I think this is likely to become, I mean, it's a challenging society already. They've had extraordinary economic growth. The good news is hundreds of millions of people are no longer poor who once were poor, which I think, I think that's kind of, it shows in a certain sense the morality of a market, which is people who once would have died, kids live. I mean, the standard of living, healthcare. I mean, there's still a long way to go, but if you look at even the countryside, I mean, the biggest benefits are like Shanghai, Beijing, coastal provinces, but even interior, I mean, there's a rising level. And I think that's exciting, that in fact, people who 30, 40 years ago had no hope today have a lot more options. Nevertheless, how this all works out politically, they just went through this big trial with Bourgeois, who was a Politburo member. They just sentenced him for life imprisonment. I mean, the general view is that he was hardly alone in looting and pillaging, but he got on the wrong side of the political divide, so they make an example of him. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on in that society. And one of the things that makes it more challenging for China is the one-child policy. I mean, the joke for a lot of China specialists is China may grow old before it grows rich. It's a radically unbalanced kind of demography in two ways, one of which is well below replacement. You need like 2.1 for replacement. Here you're talking about 1. And you're also seeing kind of the overage of men versus women, so it's hard for a lot of young men to find wives. Because, especially in the countryside, the baby girl dies. If you can only have one kid, she kind of disappears and gets tossed into the trash dump until you get a guy. Now, the government is responding to some of this. They're making changes. Rural areas now increasingly, if you have a baby girl first, you can have a second child. If both the parents are products of one-child families, you can have more than one. I mean, so they're making some adaptations there. But this is one of the challenges that China faces, that kind of a policy decision they made 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, decades later has extraordinary demographic implications that in fact could have a major impact on China's kind of power, influence. Very hard to see how it plays out. I mean, it's a fabulous country. It's a fascinating country. It's a long civilization. I mean, there's a lot to be proud of, I think, especially for Chinese looking back over the last couple of hundred years with, going through civil war, Japanese aggression, Western concessions, invasion. I mean, there's so much there that China has recovered from that the sense of pride is enormous, but the challenges for the future remain extraordinary as well. I mean, I wish China well. I have friends over there. I've enjoyed my visits. However it develops, the U.S., there's going to be challenges for the existing power and the rising power, and I just hope we have enough contacts and ties and responsible natures amongst us that we can make it work peacefully as opposed to getting into conflict, because I think that'd be tragic.
Affordable Care Act. Could you comment on the Affordable Care Act and its apparent dual aspects of private markets, choice through exchanges, personal choice versus mandates, taxes, and the legal aspects of this new law? Thank you.
I mean, the health care issue is, you talk about a complex creature. I mean, of course, the U.S. has never had a free market health care system. We have a very mixed system. In many ways, the U.S. has the worst of both worlds. That is, we have very heavy government involvement, but not full government control. So you get all sorts of weird incentives that have a lot of outcomes. The government accounts for roughly half of all medical spending, and government tax policy channels most of the rest through kind of a third-party payment system and employer-provided health insurance. Now, there is no dumber way on earth to provide health insurance than through employers. We don't get auto insurance through our employers. We don't get homeowners insurance through it. You lose your job, you lose your health insurance. You don't design your health insurance, your employer does. This is a nutty way, utterly nutty way of doing it. And beyond that is a third-party payment system. The irony is that even though we have a more private system, we actually have less individual responsibility for costs in the first instance than many European systems. Now, the problem with third-party payment is that roughly 90% of the first dollar of every health care dollar paid is paid by somebody else. Ultimately, we all pay, whether it be insurance or taxes, but the marginal cost to you is what determines what you do, where you spend it, and how much you want. So I tell people, imagine you could buy automobiles under the same system, right? You could walk into a car dealership, point at a car, and you'd pay 10%. And I tell people I would not have sitting at National Airport currently waiting for me to get back a Geo Prism. I would have a Porsche sitting there waiting for me. Because even if it's a $100,000 car, what do I care, right? $10,000, I can swing $10,000 and have the pleasure of driving a Porsche. I certainly wouldn't have a Geo Prism that I bought from my pastor a few years ago. And so we have a system that's all messed up in terms of incentives. We have a system where the wrong people decide on health insurance and, other people are paying, and that system creates, everybody wants to ration through inconvenience. I want everything because I'm not paying for it, which means the insurance company creates all these bizarre restrictions. You have to get pre-approval, and I travel a lot to the third world and I need malaria medicine, and my earlier insurance limited how many malaria pills I could get. Now, I could eventually get as many as I needed. Depending on the medicine you take, you need to start taking them a week or two before you go, and one every day, and then a couple weeks after. So say you're gone for 2 weeks, you need, I don't know, a month or a month and a half worth of pills. I could only get half of them. Everybody knew I needed more. I'm going to have to go back in and get other prescriptions. Just stupid stuff, but it's this rationing by inconvenience. So we have a system that's utterly nutty in terms of incentives. And you could really go one of two ways, in my view. One is to make a more consumer-directed system, and that's what I would advocate. Change the tax preferences, use health savings accounts. Try to create a system where you get an individual marketplace, you get reinsurance within, you get guaranteed insurability. There's a lot of stuff you can do there. The other is to make it much more of a political, governmental system. And that's what Obamacare did. That's where the president went, where Congress went. But as you note, you've got these kind of weird contradictions within. We want to expand health insurance coverage, but we want to bring down cost. Well, you can't do it. You cannot insure more people for more procedures and bring down the cost. Because if, in fact, you pay for more procedures for more people, costs go up. I'm sorry, it's just the way it does. There's no magic there. There's no way you can kind of square that circle. It's going to cost more. And that's what they're finding. Of course, they mandate a lot of kind of procedures within. You should have this as part of your insurance, even if you don't want it. We have to pay for it. It's not like it's free. So now you're paying for things you don't want, which means insurance premium costs are going up. So, of course, now we have to have government subsidies because you're having to buy it and you're having to pay for it and you don't want to. So now we have new... So every step you go in that regulatory direction then requires something else. And I think that the end result is costs will go up, pressures for subsidies will increase, and then Congress is going to face that along with all the other budget pressures, and they have to decide what to do. Well, do you increase subsidies or do you cut benefits? It's going to be an extraordinary challenge. So I think we're looking ahead to a real nasty shakeout in terms of how that all plays out. That there's a real and it doesn't matter how well-intentioned you are. There are no scientific decisions here. It's not like you decide this should be part of health insurance and that shouldn't be. And you get into the issues like the contraception mandate, where it makes no sense to have insurance cover a procedure that you control. Insurance normally covers things that are unexpected, emergency, big expenditures. So I have insurance for my house burning down. I don't have insurance for I need to replace the hose in the front yard. I have insurance for the auto if it has an accident. I don't have insurance to cover gasoline purchases. Well, we've turned health insurance into this kind of prepayment of expected medical expenses. Well, that's very expensive. And then you get into kind of the immoral religious issues where suddenly we've decided that we have to have contraceptive mandate. Well, why? This is more political than medical. So the moment you get into that political realm, you get into all these other things and raise all these other issues. So it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out. I think there's a potential crash coming ahead as some of these things start, they've already put off, for example, the employer mandate. They put off certain things, waivers. It's going to be real hard to see how this all works out and how they manage, I think, an explosion of costs, which is coming, along with the desire for more procedures and more coverage. Anyone else?
Again, I'm thanking our sponsors, Rathbone, Warwick, and Daly Investment Counselors of Boise, Home Federal Bank, and KTVB. And please join me in thanking Mr. Doug Bandow from the Cato Institute for speaking with us tonight. Thanks for coming.